Good morning. Welcome to Dev by Design. I'm Kathryn, and I am your host. As always, it is Monday. For me, it is still relatively early in the morning. We are becoming functional human beings together, as we do every week. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're back. We are wrapping up our several week long now discussion on color, using color in your UI, things to avoid, things to be aware of. This week, we are talking about mistakes that you can make, how you can avoid them, things to be aware of. We'll do kind of a little bit of a recap on what we've talked about before, and maybe at the end, we'll get into kind of the next thing we're going to talk about, which is new things in CSS to do with color, which I'm personally very excited about. So we'll just kind of see where we get. I think it'll be fun. Drop a hello in the chat if you're hanging out. So for now, let's dive in. So as we mentioned over the last few weeks, we've had this really thorough dive into colors. We talked about color theory and how colors work kind of on the screen and with our eyes. We talked about the emotions and the psychology related to specific colors, different types of color schemes, how to create them. Today, we're diving into common mistakes that are made with colors and how you can not do that in your interfaces. So the first one is probably one that you have seen pretty often, honestly, because it's a really common mistake. And that's just using too many colors. Sometimes with color, we can get really excited, like a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And before we know it, we're just really carried away. This can be really easy to do with UI design because it's rare for us to get to see the entire application together in one glance, or a website. Like, we're designing these things in bits and pieces, but for the user, they're experiencing it all kind of continually, moving from one page to the next, back and forth. When we're looking at a page, when we're coding a page, or we have it in Figma or whatever, we're looking at just that one kind of captured screen. It's kind of like when you're designing for print, you kind of get to see everything. You know, if you were designing a magazine, you'd kind of get to see the spread right next to it, like the pages next to each other. You get to kind of flip through it and physically see how it looks. We don't quite have that same experience when we're designing digitally. It can be harder to step away and take in the whole picture, but it is still possible. You just have to kind of figure out ways to do it. I like to get all of my designs kind of laid out in one artboard in Figma, or even just if you took screenshots of your website and just kind of put them all next to each other on your screen, and then just took a step back and looked at the whole thing as a unit, right? So that you kind of get the ability to look at all of the pages together. It's not necessarily exactly the way that your user would see it, but it helps you kind of see places where colors are standing out. Like, oh, there's a lot of red on that page, and red actually isn't one of our brand colors. Why did we do that? You know, or this page looks very, it's got a lot of warm colors, but then this other page has a lot of cool colors. And once you kind of dive in, you can usually see, why did I make that choice? Or what happened here? And you can adjust to make things feel a little bit more cohesive. But you can't do that if you're looking at each page in isolation. So it's just worth being aware of, because every color that you add to your color palette weakens the impact of the others. This can be kind of a good thing when it's used correctly and intentionally. You know, we talked a little bit about color schemes and the way that monochrome color schemes feel very intense, right? And so when you add other colors, you kind of naturally decrease that intensity, which can be good. But when you add more and more and more colors, you end up with almost no intensity and no impact for any of them. And that's kind of, you've gotten too far. It's important to kind of find that sweet spot, unless you're looking to create something that is very, very strong and impactful. So if you were to load a page and it would all be one color, it would probably feel just as strong and overwhelming as if you loaded a page and it was just a rainbow of colors. They kind of horseshoe around, you know? When you've gone too far in one direction, you've almost created the same. Ideally, you should aim for a UI color palette that has 3 to 5 colors. I found that that's really like the sweet zone. One of those colors should be a neutral, something, a white, a cream, a gray, something that kind of gives you something, a place for the eyes to rest. You don't want something that's so busy there's nowhere that feels restful on your page. If you feel like you don't have enough colors to play with, kind of even after that, you're like, I've got these 3 colors, but I feel really stuck. I'm having a hard time. It feels repetitive, or it feels boring, or I'm having a hard time creating contrast. Then you can start to branch out into those tints and tones of your chosen colors. So just as a reminder, when we're talking about tints and tones, we're talking about adding white or gray to your colors. So if you feel kind of stuck, you can look at like lighter variations of your colors or darker variations of your colors, muted variations of your colors. There's often more room than you think. I would say it can feel at first like I really need another color in here. I need 3 more colors in here. But you probably have, in reality, more colors than you think you do when you start playing with those tints, tones, and shades. That is a good way to add that kind of variety and depth to your color palette without getting that same feeling of like being overwhelmed or having to deal with colors that might clash, or some of the issues that you can run into when you have a color palette that has like 10 or 12 colors. It just feels overwhelming to the user, and then you've also created something that's hard for you to work with personally. Taking a brief break here to say hello in the chat. Thank you very much. I'm really glad. Like, I love to do these. I'm obviously very excited and passionate about design, and sometimes it can feel like I'm really hyped about it and no one else is. So I'm really glad that you're enjoying these. And Ivana points out that when we were talking about laying out all of the different pages from your application or your website to kind of look at all of them side by side, easy to do in spreadsheets, which is a really good. Oh no, you mean a color overwhelm is easy to do in spreadsheets. We'll find out. Both actually. Like, you could very easily drop a bunch of your page screenshots into a document and see them all lined up. So not a bad way to do it. But yeah, spreadsheets, it can be easy as well. I like to use, they give you so many colors now. And again, you get that kind of like tints, tones, and shades thing. If you were to open up, actually, I wonder if I can do that myself. Let's look at like OneDrive and open up a new Excel workbook, because I think you get all of those colors now. Or maybe I'm thinking of like Google Drive, but a lot of times they'll give you really good examples. Yeah. So here, right, we're looking at, we've got all of these colors, but then we've also got these variations up and down. Those are really good. I'm glad you said that, because it made me think about this. They do a really good job of kind of playing with these tints, tones, and shades, right? So they're an example of like, yeah, here there's whatever, 4, 8, 10 colors. If you were to use 10 colors all the way across this way, it would feel like a lot. It would feel really busy. When you stick to some of these, then it starts to feel a little bit more cohesive. So that's a good way in general in Excel, but also I wasn't sharing my screen, was I? I just realized I talked through all of that. I didn't share my screen. Oh, it's going to be a day already. I can feel it, y'all. What I was doing was looking at these colors here. Without telling you or showing you, I was just talking. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Happy Monday. I was talking about these colors. If you were to use all of them in your spreadsheet going sideways through here, you'd have a lot. When you focus on this, they've kind of got the tints and tones and shades already worked out for you. You can use the same approach even if you're not using like the pre-made colors in Excel. But this is what we're talking about. Like, if you use a light blue and dark blue, you still get that variety. You get that strong contrast between elements, but you don't get the same feeling of like visual overwhelm as you do if you were using a whole bunch of colors. Yeah. I think the past weeks of you talking about this have helped me level up my color game in spreadsheets. Yes, I am glad. It's one of those things, like, I know you probably meant this as kind of a joke, but also I think we make these kind of little design choices constantly in our lives. Um, Spreadsheets are maybe not like but how we're communicating information, right? Design touches every single piece of what we do. And when we get better about doing this, even if we're not doing necessarily like large scale application design, it makes a difference. So I say, yay. Question over here. What are the tools you use in general to document your palettes or design systems? This is a really good question. So I am really partial to Figma, right? I think Figma has some really strong tools, especially around design tokens, around colors. We'll pull that up. I like a combination of Figma for the like purely design side, for palettes, for layouts, whatever. And I like Storybook on the development side for component documentation. And some of those overlap. There's a really good Storybook plugin that lets you add your design tokens, your colors, and like your spacing and your fonts and all of that. And it was really, really handy. I also really like, so for those of you that don't know, because I don't know that I talk about it actually a lot on Dev by Design, I am the Kendo React developer advocate at Progress Software. So I am using, when I'm building, I'm using Kendo React, which is a really great, super powerful component library. They have these Figma kits. I've got one open now that lets you customize the look and feel of all of their components. I really like these when it comes to documenting the palettes I'm using and the styles that I'm using in combination with Kendo. So you can see over on the side, it's got all of my text stuff captured. It's got all of my color styles, all of everything that I'm using, all the effects, all of that is saved into the design tokens of my Figma kit here, which makes it really, really easy to work with. So that's my preference personally. If there's anything that you are like, yeah, if you have any kind of specific question beyond that, drop it in the chat, let me know. But most of the time, the answer is Figma. Big fan of Figma. So jumping back over, we are talking about mistakes that you can make with color in your user interface. First one we talked about was too many colors. Next one that we're going to look at is colors that are almost the same, but not quite. If you're ever looking to intentionally create a bad design, which I'm not really sure why you would, but some people seem to take it as a challenge, you can always reach for one trick, and that is using things that are awkwardly close, but not the same. And this honestly applies to everything in design. It applies to typography, it applies to your layout, and it definitely also applies to color. I had a professor in college who used to refer to that as like the creepy hug of design, and I think about it all the time now. What he meant, as it turns out, was like hover hands. You know, like when you see people in a photo that like go in for the hug but don't quite make it. Like the hand is just like almost there, but not quite. And that same feeling can be carried over into your design when you're using things that look like they should be the same, but aren't. It feels very like disconcerting. So like, here's an example with some colors. So like if you were to use like these two colors primarily in your system, it would start to feel really awkward because they kind of look like they should be the same color, but they're not. And so it feels like a mistake. And anytime you do that, that's what creates that feeling of like unease, is when you're like, is that the same? Is that not the same? I don't know. There is an actual like physical tension that we feel when we see things that are close but not quite the same. It's kind of like it's like the uncanny valley effect with like CGI, you know, where they talk about you can look at a CGI face and it looks almost right, but something's just off, and it sets off those kind of alarm bells in our system. Or like when you walk into a room and like all of the photos are hung like slightly off, there's a component, we want to fix it, we want to go straighten the photos, we want to like correct the thing that's wrong in the face that's making us feel that way. When our brains know that something doesn't quite match up with our expectation, it creates a feeling of unease. Even if you can't put your finger on exactly what's wrong as the viewer, we still have the sense that something is wrong. The best solution to this problem is to really commit, like one way or the other. Like pick a color and then pick a color that is far away from it so that you're not creating that kind of like misalignment. You want to give your elements like breathing room and contrast. You can overlap if you want to. You can go far away. Like you just have to commit to the hug, you know. You don't want to get caught in that awkward in between zone. So jumping back over, follow up. Yeah. Is there any checklist or index you refer to for making a design system, like colors you need, shades, states of a button, accessibility? This is a really good question. And I wish I had a great answer where I was like, yes, here's my checklist. But the truth is that it really varies for every application, every system, every brand, right? Because what's in your design system is going to be heavily based on what in your application, what needs to be in your application. States of every component are going to change based on what you need to do. So like, it's one of those that sounds like it would be really simple, right? So when we think about states of a button, we know there are some for sure that are there all the time, right? There's like the active state, there's a hover state, there's a focus state, that kind of thing. But some things, like it might be a button that opens up into like a down menu, or it might be a button that opens up a side panel, or like there's all these things that can kind of happen where you'll need to capture those states, but they won't necessarily be the standard things that everyone is doing everywhere. You know, colors you need can also vary. If you are Facebook, you have, you know, like one color. You have Facebook blue and gray, you know, and that's that. But if you are trying to think of a brand that has like a whole bunch of colors, I can't off the top of my head, but if you're almost any other brand, you might have like 3 to 5 or 6 colors, you know. So I wish the answer was yes, I do, but unfortunately the answer is no. If you are trying to create a design system, my suggestion is to work backwards from the elements that you have now, right? Because I'm guessing this isn't like a completely greenfield project. Most things aren't. It would be easier if every time we got to start something new, we get to start completely from scratch. But my guess is that you are documenting a system that already kind of exists, right? Like even if you don't have a design system documented, there is a design system in every application. So I would maybe start there and look at what you have in your application or in your website already, right? Like document every single color that's used everywhere, document every button that's used everywhere. Brad Frost actually has a term for this. He calls it interface inventory. Really, really good. I really like this approach. I'll drop this link in the chat. But yeah, he talks about it in the process of making a component library, but you can also totally use it for a design system. And it's basically, right, a collection of all of the bits and pieces that make up your interface. So going all the way through, setting up a template, screenshotting, starting to categorize those screenshots into like, here's all my buttons, here's all my headings, here's all my, whatever, accordions, tabs, images. And then you get to kind of see what's happening. It can also help you catch places. Like in this example, this is a screenshot of like all of the buttons in an application that Brad did an interface inventory on. And you can see how different they look. So it can help you catch things that might have accidentally strayed from your intended design system. So yeah, have a mostly completed project and wanted to index the things that are different and follow according to that. Yeah, that would be my approach. If you are lucky enough to be able to start from nothing, then you get to kind of, it's good and bad. I said lucky because in some ways it's really nice, because then you don't have to deal with an application that already exists and making the revisions to an application that's live, right? Because anytime we disrupt the design of an existing application, we have just user issues, user adjustments that will go with that. Because whether our design is good or bad, our users have learned to live with it, right? They've created their own patterns to accommodate for whatever issues we've created. Anytime you mix up a design, there's going to be a period of like bumps in the road before everybody resettles in. Even if the new design is better, there will always be friction. So when you start fresh, you don't have to deal with that. But the flip side is that you're working with no data, right? You are basically making a series of educated guesses about what you think you need for this application, or what you think that your users will need. But you don't actually know yet because you don't have any users. So you can kind of start this design system, but you won't really know. Like, you'll still have to make all the same edits. You'll just be making them on the design system side and not the live application side. So yeah, you win some, you lose some. But yeah, great exposure, gives freedom to be creative and learn, and keep working on edits. Yeah, look for criticism, not for praise. There is a saying that good design is invisible, right? When something is designed really, really well and it works, it just blends into the experience naturally, and you don't even think about the design. You think about what the design is enabling you to do. So, if because the design is never the goal, the design is there to support the goal of the application or website. So when you open up Microsoft Word or any word processor, you're not there to admire the layout of the user interface. You're there to write something, and the interface is there to support you in that goal. It is there to make writing something as easy as humanly possible. So when you have an interface that works, you don't think about the interface. So yes, you should always be looking for the criticism, looking for the places where it doesn't work, and not looking for the praise, because I will tell you, you will almost never get the praise. You will maybe get it from other designers once in a blue moon, but your users will not notice, for the most part, something that is well designed, and they're not supposed to. They are just supposed to be able to do what they came here to do. So, yes. But for those of you that have jumped in the in-between, today we are talking about common UI color mistakes. We're also answering any and all questions in the chat, related or not. So if you have a design question, if you have a color question, any of that, feel free, throw it in the chat. We will talk about it. Thus far, we have talked about avoiding the use of too many colors to prevent that feeling of like being overwhelmed. And we've talked about being careful to not choose things that are almost the same, but not quite, because it creates this feeling of like unease or a mistake. Similarly, in the feeling of unease, you need to be aware of what's called vibrating colors. So when you are working with a palette that includes really bright colors, you'll need to be aware of how they interact with each other. So vibrating colors happen when two really bold, bright colors are placed right next to each other. Because when we look at things, our eyes actually retain an after image. So think about like like the bright spot after a camera flash, right? If you like get your photo taken and it goes ka-cha, and you see spots for a minute afterwards, or like if you look at the sun for too long, or you look at like an exposed light bulb for too long and then you look away, you kind of see that after image retained, right? And it works the same way with really bright colors, especially on the computer, which is also a light source. You know, it's light behind the colors. But when we get that after image, it can overlap with the colors that are next to it and then distort those colors. And that causes them to look like they are literally moving as our eyes are kind of moving on the page. So like, let's look at an uncomfortable example. Let's see if I can get it bright enough and big enough for you guys to feel the vibrating effect. Drop in the chat if you're uncomfortable. But yeah, this is an example of vibrating colors. You can see it especially, I would say this one with the orange and blue really struggles, and this with the yellow and blue. And here with the red and green. When they're really bright, you get that moving effect. Here's another one. Let's be uncomfortable together. It's really grating, right? Like it feels like visually a little painful to look at. I won't keep it up because it is actively uncomfortable. But you got to be aware of those. Yeah. Correct. It is physically uncomfortable to look at. So if you are working with a color palette that has a lot of these really bright colors, or colors that are especially like opposite to each other on the color wheel, they will often have that vibrating effect if you put them right next to each other. So you need to be careful not to do so. Back in the chat. Have you ever worked to create your own SVGs? If so, how do you make them? There's not a single course or source to make scalable and proportionally similar when compared. All right, I lost you a little bit at the end on proportionally similar. So if you could expand on that in the comments, maybe. But yes, I have created my own SVGs before. Mostly when I'm doing it, it is for UI animation, because when you have your own SVGs are really great for animation because you can hook into those specific like elements in an SVG and animate parts of them, right? So yes, is the short answer. I like to make them in like a design program. So Figma is good for that. You can do it in Illustrator is really great for working with like vectors and stuff. But that's really, I like to do it. I like to create vector art and then export as an SVG. And then as a developer, I can go in and kind of clean up. Sometimes when you export, you get like some crap in there that you don't really need. It's just a side effect of exporting machine generated code. Go clean it up a little bit and then use that as a basis to like hook in. But to try and like actually create like a complex SVG illustration from scratch in code is hard, frankly. Doable, but hard. So I would say, yeah, I like to start with a software, a design software, and then export. So talking about proportionally similar, when I create two icons, one looks big when compared with the other. So usually in SVGs, what that has to do with is like the frame that you're working with. So when you, like in Figma, there's like artboards, right? And so you're creating on an artboard. And that kind of creates the maximum size for your design. Why am I doing this with my hands? I could literally just open Figma. It's just going to be that kind of a day, I guess. Where I keep forgetting that I can just share my screen. So let's make a new file. You get these frames, right? And you want your frames to be the same. And you want your icon to take up as much space in the frame as it needs, right? So like they should each take up the entirety of their allotted size. Because otherwise, if you have one that's like this big and one that's like this big, you'll see a difference. Similarly, though, you'll kind of feel that if you're working on different frame sizes, even though like this takes up all of its frame and that takes up all of its frame, they're different sizes, because this frame is larger than this frame. And so you'll that can be a place where that happens. It might not be necessarily the exact issue that you're dealing with, but I have made this mistake, so it could be that. But yeah, with SVGs, you should also, you can open, if you are comfortable working in the code, you should be able to open the code, open the SVG in an editor, and take a look at it that way, and standardize the size there. A lot of times when I run into that issue where things are feeling misaligned from a size perspective, it's because I got them from two different sources. So like if I'm using, free resource SVGs that I downloaded from a website somewhere, they're not all going to be standardized in the same way. So then it's up to you to go in and standardize them, which is possible. It's just a little extra work. So win some, lose some. But hello and welcome to new folks. Let's see. Eye icon and then a paper icon. They look way too different. Yeah, you're probably also dealing a little bit there, I would guess, just because of what those icons are. You're dealing with differences horizontally and vertically, right? So eyes tend to be horizontal. You get that like oval shape. Documents tend to be big vertical rectangles. So you might be fighting some of what happened with Figma with your your base document size there, but you're also probably fighting just a natural feeling of one not feeling as big as the other because one is naturally taller than the other. So kind of two things at play there. You might need to make your eye icon slightly larger than your document icon is for them to feel visually balanced, just because of how they're laid out and how much space they take up on the page, even if they have the exact same width. Ooh, I can't enunciate. Even if they have the exact same width, the eye icon will feel smaller than the paper icon, because they have different heights. So could be that. But jumping back, we're talking a little bit about colors today. We're talking about mistakes that you can make with colors in your UI. We talked about too many colors. We talked about colors that are almost the same, but not quite. We just talked about vibrating colors and caused everyone some visual pain. And now we're going to talk about low contrast colors. As always, drop questions in the chat about colors, about design, about whatever. We do it all here. We're just hanging out. It's Monday morning for me. I've got my coffee. We're talking about colors. So we've talked about contrast on this show a little bit before, mostly in the realm of accessibility. And while it is still super true that ensuring a high enough contrast is especially important for accessible design, it's also just something that is good to do and will make your design look better, which, side note, is pretty much true for everything accessibility related, right? If you are doing things to improve the accessibility of your application or website, you are also doing things that will benefit your website as a whole or your application as a whole. Accessibility features are not only for people who need them, they benefit all of us. So let's take a look at an example of a bad low contrast design. So here's one that we've got where we were looking at low contrast, right? So we've got just whites and grays and really, really light grays, right? So it's really hard here for us to read this small text, especially these guys up here in the menu, right? And there's a lot of things at play here, but most of it is that there's just not enough contrast. The text is really, really thin. They've used this like super light font. So we've got these really skinny lines of color that is not that different from the background color. Not only is it inaccessible, it's also just bad. It's just kind of boring, right? Like, it's just not exciting to look at. The only thing that's really different here that draws the eye to any of these is maybe these icons. And then we've got this big black get started button. So it's just not fun to look at. You don't get a feel really for what this company does, what this website is for. There's no communication happening about, like, how are you supposed to feel looking at this? It's almost completely neutral, which is just not exciting, right? Like, we just start to glaze over. We need those pops of contrast, whether that's like color contrast, contrast in your typography, photos, to break up these like walls of text, illustrations. Like, they've got icons, and that's kind of it. But yeah, all of that is what draws us in and engages us. It's not, it's about more than just create contrast because we have to. It's also create contrast because contrast is interesting. Like, contrast is fun. Some people can be really afraid of color, of using color incorrectly, or of, like, they just don't really know what to do with it. So they'll just kind of avoid using colors altogether. And while I understand that fear, that's also like such a shame, you know? Like, if the whole internet was like light gray text on white backgrounds, it would be just, really uninspiring, really boring. Like, we want photos, we want colors, we want background colors, or anything really. Had there been colors in this example, they not only would have made their website more readable, more accessible, but they also would have made it approximately 1,000 times more interesting to look at. And that's really our goal, right? Like, especially a website like this where they seem to be selling something, you want to hook people in. Like, you want them to be interested and to come back. So worth looking at colors from that perspective as well. All right, checking in with the chat. Hello, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for coming back. And yeah, I'm glad that worked out for you. Sometime I would love you to check back in with, like, I'd love to see this design, just because, like, as the weeks have gone by, we've gotten to talk about it a bunch. So, like, I'm really curious now, like, what you're building. For everyone else, we are checking in on common UI color mistakes. We talked about too many colors, colors that are almost the same, vibrating colors, and we just talked about really low contrast and, like, not using enough colors. So another one that I want to call out is gradients that kind of turn gray in the middle, right? And this is one that's much easier to kind of understand with a visual example. I feel like this has happened to a bunch of us, where we go to create a gradient and we end up with something that looks like this, where we get this like blah that happens in between. And it's just really, it's just really gross to look at. You know, it feels really washed out. It feels really muted. And it's probably not what we were going for when we intended to, like, transition between those colors. Those mushy colors that happen in the middle happen anytime that you have to cross through the middle of the color wheel, right? So because the center of the RGB color wheel is white, anytime you have to go through that, you also have to go through this kind of like muted grayish thing that happens as you get really close to the middle, like those kind of pastels and grays, which muddies your colors. But the good news is this is also really easy to fix. You just don't go straight through the middle. You curve around the wheel, around the side. So there's an example over here where we're going between the same two colors, right? This blue and this yellow. When we cut straight through the middle, we get the grays that happen here as we come close to that white center. But if we arc around the side, we get to skip that. And it stays really bright, and really interesting, really engaging. The thing to be aware of here is that when you do this, you technically add other colors to your gradient. As you can see here, we get this green, which makes sense. That is just what happens when you mix these colors. If that's something that cannot happen for whatever reason in your design, if that green would feel really off, or you're I don't know, there's some reason why you don't want that there, you can try to cut closer in here. You'll still get a little bit of it, of the green, but not as vibrant. Or you can just play with not necessarily transitioning from one color to another. You can create gradients between tints, tones, and shades of a single color. So you could create just a gradient of blue, moving from a lighter blue to a darker blue, or just a gradient of yellow, moving from a lighter yellow to a darker yellow. If for whatever reason, adding in this kind of third color here is not an option. But most of the time, I think this here, where you arc around the color wheel, creates a much more natural look to your gradient and helps you avoid all this kind of gray meh in the middle, which most of the time, not what you want. Next thing that is worth avoiding is communicating information through color alone. And again, this is one that we've touched on a little bit in past episodes, but I really want to talk about it here because it's really, really an important mistake to avoid, right? So color is powerful, and we know that because we have spent weeks talking about it. However, it is also important for us to remember that color is not always accessible or available to all of our users. And at first, you might just think about literally your blind or your colorblind users when we're talking about this, but it's not just them. It's actually all of us, right? Especially now with night shift and stuff on your phones. So for me, right, a couple hours before bed, my phone shifts and everything gets that orange tint, right? And honestly, during the day, I keep some of that on as well. I use Flux on my Mac, which helps shift away from those blue colors because I stare at my screen all day because this is my job. And when I don't do that, I end up with headaches, So we're not always in control of how our users are moderating or adjusting our colors. And that could be something as noticeable and intentional as night shift, or it could be something like they just have a bad monitor that doesn't have high contrast, or they have adjusted the settings on their monitor to intentionally be low brightness. All of those things impact the interpretation of the colors that you use in your website or application. It could be as simple as they're using their phone with sunglasses on. They have tinted sunglasses, or they have slightly tinted glasses. There are some people that have slightly blue or yellow tinted glasses to offset vision issues. So that being said, the important part here is that you are not relying on color as the only way of communicating information to your users. It is a very easy trap to fall into because we get really used to it. We start thinking about what colors mean and how we can use colors, and especially when we are the ones creating the design or coding the application, we know what it's supposed to do. So we've kind of got that cheat code. It's hard for us to be completely unbiased when we're looking at our own designs because we know how they're supposed to work. And there's some tricks we can try and do to defamiliarize ourselves with it, and we can do user testing, and that helps. It's important. But when we look at our own work, it's hard for us to judge it completely unbiased because we know what it's supposed to mean, It's kind of like trying to fill out a crossword when you've already seen the answers. You can try to forget, and you probably won't remember every single answer, but you'll remember enough that it won't be as challenging as it would be to solve the crossword with nothing. So that being said, here is an example of a bad use of using color to communicate information alone. And this is a really, really common one. We see this all over, right? form validation. So when you fill things out and it's not correct, or you haven't filled it out at all, it's still something that you need to fill out, you get that red ring around the input box. And yeah, that's okay, I guess, but it doesn't actually tell you anything other than something's wrong. It doesn't tell you what's wrong. It doesn't tell you how it's wrong. It doesn't tell you how to fix it. And if you can't see, if you're red-green colorblind or if you have night shift on, you probably can't see this like at all. It would take a couple of tries to notice that some boxes have outlines and some boxes don't. So this is not what you want. This is to be avoided. On the other hand, here, we'll move our bad example over here a little smaller. Here's a good example, right? So here's form validation that's doing something very similar, right? So when something is incorrect, we still get the red ring. We still get, the color changes over here in the label, but we also get an explanation over here, right? So it tells us what's wrong. It tells us how it's wrong. And that gives us something beyond just the color to identify what's happening here. Similarly, we get the green validation when something's right, but it's not just the color. We get this check mark icon in the right side of the input box, and that gives us something else. So if you were to look at this in grayscale, okay, I wonder if there's a quick and easy way for me to do that. Let's see if we can quickly do things in grayscale. But if you looked at these in grayscale, you would still be able to figure out what was good and what was bad. We're going to use Photopea because I love them. It blows my mind now that Photoshop can basically exist within the browser. Like the fact that this used to take my whole computer to run, like my computer would sound like it had just ran a marathon to run Photoshop, and now I can run a Photoshop clone of my browser. What's it doing? Yep, mode. Is there a quick way for me to grayscale? Oh, I'll do it over here in the modes. Yeah, so zooming in here, almost impossible to tell which ones have that red ring around them, right? You can see maybe, meanwhile, if we drop in our good example, and we grayscale that, we still tell, right? So we can still see the ones that work because we still get that check mark there that gives us another form of feedback. And we can still tell the ones that don't work because we get that information next to it over here. So super, super important to make sure that we are always communicating information in things that are more than just color. We can use color to reinforce our ideas, to reinforce information, because that is definitely worth doing. Like, color is powerful. It's worth using color as much as we can, because we should use every tool in our toolbox when we are designing, right? There's no need to skip anything that might give us in quickly communicating to our users. But that being said, we should never be exclusively reliant on just one method of communicating information. And that goes for color, but it goes for everything else as well. Anytime that we can communicate something in more than one way, anytime we can reinforce information in multiple ways through a design, that makes our design stronger. So, well worth doing, well worth looking into when you're kind of laying things out and figuring out what's important on your page. What is the thing that you want a user to take away when they're interacting with your interface? That's the thing that you want to reinforce as much as possible. So, all right, folks, we are just about at our hour for today. With these tips and tricks that we've discussed over the last few weeks, you guys should be in a really good place now to make informed color choices for your interfaces. Color is one of the first tools and the best tools that you can use to grab a user's attention and the color that you use in your interfaces can have a really big impact on your users' perception of your app, your brand, like your site, everything. Really, color is so powerful. It's a really important tool, so you want to make sure that you are always using it thoughtfully. And you should be in a pretty good place to do that now, I think. If you tune in next week, we are going to take a look at the future of color in CSS, because this is, after all, dev by design. And so now that we've talked about design stuff, it's time to shift over and talk just for a week about dev stuff, about especially the future of color, because we've got some really, really, really cool things happening in CSS around color, especially around P3 colors and the wider color gamut that's going to be available to us soon. I don't want to spoil too much, or I'll have nothing to talk about next week. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks for hanging out. As always, if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, drop them in the chat. You can find me on Twitter at Kathryn Grayson. You can always chat me there, ask questions, DMs, whatever. Otherwise, I will see you here, same time, same place next week for another episode of Dev by Design. Thanks, you guys.